This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. Before I get too deeply into this video, I kind of concluded from this. So initially when I started, trying to do music, I was fairly firm on the idea that I didn't want to do teaching. And so in this video, you'll see me kind of discussing my first sort of 5-6 years of trying to pretty much make my income from being a gigging guitarist. Now, you'll see through the video how that goes. But what I would encourage early on is to develop an idea that there are other sources of income that are actually just as important as gigging when you are trying to make it as a gigging guitarist, because there's whole periods of the year, as being any self-employed musician has probably had the same experience, where it's pretty seasonal work. So from January, February and like October, November, those can be pretty quiet months. And especially when something like potentially COVID could happen, that for me is when it really took over, that doing this kind of online stuff and having other sources of income actually took over from my gigging income. But up to that point, I was mostly focused on gigs as the sole source of income. So the idea with that is to get as full a diary as possible and be playing music as much as possible. On with the video. Okay, I wanted to make this video about like the truth of being a gigging guitarist for me, kind of my truth, and what's kind of interesting about this for me, and maybe it'll be interesting to you if you're thinking about getting into guitar, whether you wondered, whether people playing in wedding bands and pub bands and stuff like that made much money, or how to go about doing this sort of thing. So the story is that I live in the southwest of England, which is quite rural. Not loads of people, but there are quite a lot of weddings that happen down here, like around Cornwall and Devon. There are a lot of kind of like wedding barns and stuff like that. And this starts in the year 2015 for me, is when I actually decided, right, I'm going to stop doing a real job. So before that, I went to uni and did commercial music for 2 years, which was a waste of time. I left that and went and got a job in Morrison's in a petrol station. I worked there for a few years, where I met Deep Impact, and shortly after that, well, I was working there for a few years really, and then I got a job kind of working for a friend of the family. He had this like business going around hospitals in the UK telling them what to do for money, and a bit of a weird job that. Yeah, and in 2014, I think I got my first bit of work from the guy Paddy, who plays bass for that pedal show band. He got asked to play guitar for a local production of Jesus Christ Superstar, and because he couldn't read music, he knew me from going to jam nights and stuff, and he kind of just said, can you read music? Could we do this? There was 2 guitar parts. If you teach me a guitar part, you could come play this as well, and we could do this gig together. We did like a week of that. That was kind of the first time that I was earning like a bit of money from doing regular music work, and it kind of made me think. And then there was sort of jam nights happening in local venue, like the Sorry Head it was called, and basically I started to get to know some of the musicians around here and saw that there was some amount of work. I was living with my parents in this house, And that was what made me decide that in 2015 I was going to just try and do this for a job. It's about 10 years that I've been doing it now, right? So year one, I had 105 gigs. It's actually not too bad in terms of actually getting like a little bit of money. I earned £8,790 that year, which was a significant pay cut for me, obviously, but that was what I thought would happen my first year, right? That it didn't really matter so much about the money. I had some savings. I was living with my parents, and I decided, right, what I want to do is see if I can make some money playing guitar. So 105 gigs to make 8,790. The highest paid gig that I got that year was £280, which would have been a wedding, right? And so what I was doing was quite a lot of jam nights and some open mic nights. Myself and my wife, she wasn't my wife at the time, but we did like open mic nights. We ran an open mic night in Torquay, and we'd get like £50 each for that. And so that was quite a lot of it, and then sort of jam nights, and then the odd bit of work came in. Then 2016, I think by this point I started to play keyboard in a 60s tribute band. Now this band called Carnaby Street, quite a lot of pub gigs and the occasional wedding and the occasional kind of social club type thing. That year I did 127 gigs. That year I actually made £20,667.45, mostly from gig money. There's a really key reason that I made quite a lot of money that year. There was 127 gigs, but also I did an entire month in Israel, which was November, and we got like $100 a night for playing there. So that was quite a cool experience for me. Yeah, so 127 gigs plus like an extra 30 in Israel. The highest amount of money that I got for a gig there, Carnaby Street, the 60s band that I played in, we put on our own local show in Exeter. I got one £859 gig. Aside from that, 275 was like the peak, which is slightly lower than the year before. But yeah, in one night to make £859 for a gig, that's the highest I've ever made on one gig. Quite a significant chunk. So that year was made up of the regular kind of open mic night with my wife, and also then some of the wedding gigs and bits and pieces that I was doing on guitar, but predominantly slightly lower paid gigs than the function gigs with this 60s band playing piano. And if you are able to play a few instruments, I think you'll find that getting work in this kind of thing is a little bit easier. So the way that I met these people was, again, these same jam nights through that kind of local scene. You turn up, you play your guitar, you turn up, you play a bit of piano. Word gets around that you play a bit of piano, a bit of guitar. When a band is looking for a pianist or a guitarist, potentially your name might come up. That's kind of how it's always worked for me. 2017, year 3, I had 159 gigs, so quite a lot more gigs, slightly less money than the year before, 19,225. And I think by this point I was starting to supplement my income by doing some copywriting for my wife's boss, who, you know, she like worked in marketing for estate agents and stuff, so I was writing articles to supplement my money a bit. But you can see that year 2 I kind of peaked. Year 3 I was making slightly less, and then by year 4, 2018, same sort of situation. I made £18,715.30 on 120 gigs. So I'm also getting less gig offers. So what has happened is that I find when you're new and able to say yes to lots of gigs, you get a lot of gigs. As time wears on, you start to, if you're in your own band and playing in your own kind of band where you're having to then say no to other gigs, you get asked to do gigs less. So what I found is that, yeah, basically the first couple of years is the hardest you'll be working, and probably also the most you'll be saying yes to stuff. And that has a snowball effect of you being able to say yes to more stuff. If you get into a regular band, you have to say no more often, probably, unless you're going to really annoy your band members. And then what that means is that you might get less gig offers. So again, that year would have been carrying on with the same open mic nights and playing keyboard mostly with that band. 2019 year 5, something changed. I earned 25,566 in this year, doing 142 gigs. Now, the peak for this year was £350, so that's 370, so a little bit higher than years before. I think by this point I'd started to play for some agency stuff. So there's a few of these around the UK now where basically they book weddings and then you kind of show up on the day and play gigs with these bands. I might do more videos on actually playing in a wedding band because it's kind of an interesting thing. But these were sort of higher paid than the gigs that I was doing in general with my 60s band. So what I was able to do is take kind of midweek or non-Saturday, non-Sunday gigs, drive around the UK and play some agency gigs. So 25,566, I think that's a respectable kind of amount of money for what I was doing. As I said, 142 gigs. It gets difficult to fill your diary, and this is the thing as well about being a musician. The stuff that you can fill your diary with, because it feels like any night off is basically kind of wasted money, especially early on. The stuff that you can fill your diary with, like midweek cafe gigs down here, they're sort of £40, £50 was what we were getting. You can be really busy, but it kind of gets more and more difficult to make that money because it's the weekend functiony stuff where you're making like actual quite a good amount of money, like between 180 to 250 pounds is, I guess, the average that I was getting for like an actual function gig, which I was depping for these agency bands and stuff. So I also, in the year 2019, I nearly got to play, you know, there was that thing, that Rage Against the Machine tribute band where the woman kind of got in a bit of trouble for weeing in the face of an audience member on camera. I nearly played guitar for that band, but yeah, I didn't in the end because their guitarist was fine. By 2020, year 6, I did 2 gigs in that year. You can remember that's the COVID year, right? And then 2021, year 7, I did 30 gigs. So after COVID, I really sort of reevaluated this thing because I could see basically in 2019, just before lockdown, was a couple of things actually. Just before that, I decided to leave the 60s band, which I've been playing in for about 3 years, because I could see that playing guitar for these agency bands actually was earning me quite a lot more money. I think on average I would get like 80 to 120 pound for the keys gig, and you know, piano is not my first instrument, but it was busy, that band, and I thought I'd rather be less busy but earning more money. So the guitar gigs, as I said, between 180 and 240, so like I could be about half as busy as I was in the 60s band and still make the same amount of money, if that makes sense. That plan went to bollocks because in 2020 obviously everything got locked down, but luckily I'd started YouTube then, so by the time that we got back to gigging, it's never really picked back up again for me gig wise. I do a couple of gigs a month maybe, and in the summer months it's a bit busier. And what I found is actually, because I didn't used to supplement my income with like teaching and stuff, which I think is a really good idea, have some sort of second income if you're going to be a gigging guitarist, the online stuff kind of filled that gap really nicely. Talking of developing other sources of income, TrueFire sponsor this channel, and as part of my arrangement with them, I like to point out courses on there that I think are of value and are interesting. Now, there's a particular thing that jumped out at me recently. Eric Haugen has a new pentatonic double stops course on there, which has made me think about maybe trying to systematize this sort of thing for myself a bit more. I think obviously we're all familiar with the pentatonic scale, but specifically what his course seems to be looking at is this idea of playing this kind of thing. Which could actually be really useful for kind of like funkier gigs and that sort of stuff, and some of the really cool stuff that Cordy does. That's something that's caught my attention that I want to take a bit of a deeper look at, because I think it could be what I can kind of do that sort of slowly, but I don't have like an amazing kind of quick fluency or fluidity with the pentatonic stuff at the moment. So I'm thinking maybe Eric has some tips for kind of systematizing it. And the Matteo Sasato thing, he does quite a lot of that as well. And so that was one thing that stood out for me at the moment, Eric Haugen's pentatonic kind of double stops course. You can use the code JNC100 to get $100 off of their all-access pass, which means you could dip in and out of Tim Miller's stuff, Andy Timmons stuff, Andy Wood stuff, Tim Lurch's stuff, Martin Taylor's stuff if you're into jazz, all the Eric Haugen stuff. Josh Smith's got stuff on there. Yeah, $100 off of their all-access pass, which you can use for the entire year, and dip in and out of various courses, or all the courses, and use it kind of like Netflix for inspiration and stuff like that. Or you could use the code JNC40 to get 40% off of any individual course. So for instance, if you like the sound of that Eric Haugen course, you could use the code JNC40 to get 40% off of that. So yeah, something now like 30 gigs a year is about where I'm happy. So another thing that you should know about like playing in the UK in this kind of function scene is that it's really pretty seasonal. So between sort of March maybe and September is where you're kind of busiest, and then sort of November, October, probably a bit quiet. February, January, those are really, really quiet months. And it's kind of difficult as well. So this is the other thing that you should know about being a guitarist, especially if you're doing a lot of dep gigs, which is where you're standing in for other bands. The work is really highly concentrated. So you'll probably find, this is the way it's been for me, that through those summer months, you're probably having to learn a couple of set lists at a time, and so balancing that can be really hard as well. And this is the thing, although I think actually like a function gig, sort of 200, 250 pounds, on the face of it is quite well paid, and compared to jobs that I've done like working in a supermarket, is definitely better than that. And I would encourage any musician who's complaining about playing wedding gigs to try working in a supermarket. I think it's, you see the difference, like actually playing an instrument is, to me, way more fun, and that was why I made that decision, right? But it's really quite a lot of time, especially early on when you're doing a lot of dep gigs, and when you've not done much of this, where you're learning set lists, and it feels probably like you're learning set lists all the time, and not necessarily getting loads of time to dedicate to like practice on stuff that you necessarily want to. So although you kind of think about a job as a gigging musician as being like a Friday, Saturday, Sunday thing, and with some midweek stuff maybe, actually to get those Friday, Saturday, Sunday filled up, you probably have to spend quite a bit of time midweek actually learning these sets. And if you think like a set list, typically early on, quite a lot of it will be new to you. So you might have like 15, 20, 25 songs that you have to learn. That's quite a lot of pressure. As time goes on, you start to get familiar with what stuff is commonly in a set list. And to me these days, like learning a gig for a set list might include like 4 to 8 actual new songs, and then the rest of it is sort of like refreshing stuff you already knew. So the work gets easier in that regard, but it's also a little bit, you get called a bit less, I've found anyway, for gigs when you're known to be in a regular band. So like I'm again, after lockdown, myself and my wife, we joined an agency band, and for those gigs I'd be getting £250, which is great, and we were busy enough for me, I think, but if that was your sole amount of income, you think you need to be out gigging pretty much every weekend. What would that get you? So something like £52, 52 times 250, it would only get you £13,000. So you do really need to get a lot of work in between. So Saturdays, you can be most of the time fairly confident about getting a gig a lot of the time. It's the midweek stuff that really did help kind of keep things ticking over. If you could get like a £50 gig in the middle of the week, £50 to £100, that can make a really big difference. Some like residencies, that sort of thing can really help. But what I would say is that you need to be at the start of your career trying to say yes to everything, doing the best job that you can. Don't too quickly get into your own sort of band if you're trying to make a name for yourself, because I think you have to be saying yes to lots of things to start off with before people will start to remember you and that sort of stuff. So I thought maybe that might be slightly interesting to some people. My best year, kind of mostly solely gig income, sort of £25,566. That's not bad. 142 gigs that was, and some supplementary work. I think 25% of that at least would have been work copywriting. So maybe 20,000, 142 gigs. What is that average? About £140 gig. So this is another thing, you know, if you've got a certain amount of days that you could fill, like this is kind of the thing with being a gigging guitarist, like there is a peak to how much you can earn. And I don't think there are that many gigs out there paying over sort of £300-400. So there is sort of like a ceiling to how much you can earn. And so that's something to think about with this stuff as well. If you're interested in earning the most money ever, then a wedding musician might not be the easiest way to do that. But also be a singing guitarist. If you can get work just playing acoustic guitar and singing, then you can pick up way more gigs and probably make a little bit more money as well, because you can get hired just you, and therefore the fees can be a bit higher without people questioning them. I don't sing like that, but I see people that do that, and they probably make a little bit more money and probably get way more gigs. So yeah, my busiest year, 159 gigs. Not too bad, is it? It's out quite a lot of the... But it also meant that there was 206 nights of the year where I wasn't doing something. So there is definitely a need for something else to do, I think, a secondary amount of income. And I guess that's why I started doing this online stuff. I don't know if that's interesting at all. Now that I look back on it, maybe not as interesting as I was thinking when I was looking at the numbers. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments. Yeah, also the monies for gigging have gone up slightly for me, but not massively. So, and I think people might be able to tell you in the comments that probably these might be similar numbers to what they were making sort of 10 years ago. For me, for instance, the kind of like average gig fee has not gone up since about 2018. So that's something to bear in mind. Cheers.